the interesting ways that that office has intersected with Alabama and Alabamians for the last 200 and so years of the state. The first presidential visit to Alabama came on the eve of statehood in 1819 up in Huntsville. And so this is an exhibit about American presidential visits to the state, First Lady visits, vice presidents, presidential hopefuls, and another session which talks about Alabamians in the White House. And so Alabamians who have visited or worked in the White House over the years. So you want to check that out. That is on our website, archives.alabama.gov, one of several new digital exhibits we have there. I have an important schedule note change for you if you're paying close attention and you're a regular Food for Thought attendee, and we hope that you are. Frank Adams, who is our June Food for Thought speaker, is unable to attend, and so we have done a bit of a switcheroo. And so in May 16th, which is the next time we'll be in here, the third Thursday of next month, we'll have Dr. Leighton Revel. Dr. Revel was the co-founder of the Southern Negro Leagues Museum and is the new director of a Center for Negro Leagues Research. This presentation that we were going to have in June that we're now going to have in May is really fits in with the Major League Baseball game that we're going to have at Rickwood Field later this summer, which is going to honor the Southern Negro League players. So you'll want to be sure to attend that on May the 16th. Our originally scheduled May speaker, Christina Snyder, who was going to talk about slavery in Indian country, the changing face of captivity in early America, she will be our June speaker. So we're just moving the schedule around a bit. The best way to keep up with that change is going to be on our website and our social media accounts. If you're not signed up for our email updates, you can go to our website and do that. Our next event here will be May 30th at noon. We'll have a book talk with Jennifer Horn. Many of you probably remember that she is a former poet laureate of the state, and Jennifer has a new book out, a biography of Sarah Mayfield, who was an author herself, a folklorist, and spent quite a bit of her life here in Montgomery. So that will be May 30th here at noon. You'll want to be sure to put that on your calendar. As always, we thank the supporters for this program, which is the Alabama Humanities Alliance, and our own support group, the Friends of the Alabama Archives. If you're not a member of that organization, you can pick up a flyer on your way out. The Friends organization helps support our public programming, supports artifact conservation, and other educational and public outreach that we do throughout the year. And we deeply appreciate that support. So it gives me a great honor today to introduce to you our good friend Mike Bunn. He's a longtime friend of the department, but also a longtime personal friend. And it's always happy to have him come and speak to us. He's a historian author who has worked at cultural heritage organizations throughout the Southeast. He currently serves as the director of historic Blakeley State Park and Spanish Fort. He's the author and co-author of many books, including 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South, which I believe is the last time, Mike, you spoke here, was on 14th Colony. But he's also written a book on early Alabama, an illustrated history, Alabama from Territory to Statehood, which was a publication that he did during the bicentennial, and Well Worth Stopping to See, which is a book on Columbus, Georgia, as seen through the eyes of its travelers. Mike has a new book coming out on the history of antebellum Mobile that we'll want to definitely look out for. Mike writes books faster than most of us write articles. And if he weren't such a nice guy, that would really make us all angry. But since he's nice, we let him get away with it. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce you today to our friend Mike Bunn. He's going to talk to you about this publication and the work that he does at Blakeley State Park. If you don't have a copy of this, you can get one in our museum store. Mike will be happy to sign it for you. Mike, come on up.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you having me. Always a pleasure to be here in the archives. A lot of folks, a lot of good friends who are involved in doing really good work. So it's an honor to be a part of the program. What I want to do today is to tell you about the Battle of Fort Blakeley and try to help you understand a little bit of the context, the course of the battle, what happened, what its results were like, and to introduce you a little bit to the story of the people who actually participated. So let me state from the beginning, the book that I wrote I'm basing the presentation on. And the book is a narrative about the battle. It's really the first single book narrative devoted to telling the story of the battle, because it's been chapters in a lot of books about what happened in the Mobile area during the war. But the book is also a guide of sorts, sort of, and think of it as an extended park guide. So I literally wrote it and arranged it, and we'll discuss it from the viewpoint of a person who's wanting to discover the battlefield. So I've got a lot of quotes from individuals. So if you were in our park, and it's a big park, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, you could really figure out where every unit was and learn a little bit about the men who were fighting there from the book. And so I'll discuss the battle sort of as you would read the book in a way. I'm gonna have a lot of photos, so you'll be looking up here more than you're looking at me, and that's probably for the benefit of everyone. But we'll move quickly. I'm going to put some quotes up there, and I'm just going to read you some of the highlight moments, so to speak. I won't expect you to read every word on the screen, because my goal is to give you just a general understanding and impression of what this experience was like and its consequence. So we'll get started. And that, as I said, that's the cover of the book. That image there is a painting that was done during the Alabama Bicentennial, portraying the Battle of Fort Blakeley. Previous to that, the only description that I had seen of the battle was one that was from a Harper's Weekly newspaper, which was depicted showing from behind federal lines, which was a great image, but just didn't capture a lot of detail. And we do all of our public history reenactments, all that sort of stuff is in the part of the battlefield we call Redoubt 4. It's the fourth of 9 readouts, and I'll explain that. But this is sort of the ground zero for a lot of public interpretation. So we wanted to do something from that perspective, because that's the perspective a lot of the public gets to see. And to create that have that historic space and sort of create the understanding of what it looked like that day was what our goal was. So that's what that image is from. All right. Are we advancing? Yes. Okay. So some few images just to help you understand the context of where Fort Blakeley is at. So this is a wartime map, which is nice and colorful, shows Mobile on the left, Blakeley at the top right. I believe I've got a pointer. Yeah. And then that Spanish fort, and of course, this is Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan. And I've got another map, which is a little closer detail. That's downtown Mobile, and the rings of fortification that surrounded it, the tail end of the war, all the various batteries and obstructions that were in the waterway, defending access to Mobile. And there's some that we see on some of our cruises that we go out of Blakeley. And then you got Spanish Fort and Blakeley. So first of all, just a quick overview. What we're talking about is the culminating battle in the campaign for Mobile. This is the last major combined forces operation in the war, targeted the city of Mobile, which had been a target of Union forces for several years, but various things had arisen that had caused a delay in those plans. So there had been plans underway and organized to capture Mobile as early as 1862. It's a fourth largest city in the Confederacy, major population center, rail communication center, and of course, a shipping center. And so there were several plans to capture the place, but one thing or another, some political, some military, there's always seemed to be an urgent need for the numbers of men that were required to go down and capture Mobile. And so it kind of got postponed throughout the war. And as those postponements are happening, Mobile is only fortifying itself more and more. So when the Federal Army and Navy arrived to actually try to capture Mobile, they're arriving at a place that had 4 years to prepare. So they knew it was going to be a tough job. As I mentioned, it was the fourth largest city at the beginning of the war. So it's a city of about 30,000 people. For several reasons, it had been a target, and it's a major operation. So this is not the Battle of Mobile Bay. So here's some numbers of the Battle of Mobile Bay. That's August of 1864. It's a naval battle with a really relatively small level siege to capture Forts Morgan and Fort Gaines that closed the bay to Confederate shipping, although there had been quite a number of successes of getting out of Mobile Bay, even despite the blockade. So it's a pretty big battle. Just throw up some numbers there to help you get some context. You can see the size of the armies there. It's all designed to capture the lower end of the fort. A lot of people get confused on that, so I apologize if you know all this geography, but a lot of people I talk to are confused about the Battle of Mobile Bay. They thought Mobile fell. What the Battle of Mobile Bay did was close the bay to Confederate shipping, and effectively, as one of the commanders there said, turn Mobile Bay into a Union lake. But the city of Mobile remained in Confederate hands. So that's the famous, just going through a few images of the battle to familiarize yourself with, damn the torpedoes, all that. That's Battle of Mobile Bay, August 1864. And that's Fort Morgan, the center piece of all that. So what happened right after that, August 1864, the Federal Army and Navy were desirous of capturing Mobile, but they weren't quite sure that they had the forces on hand to go ahead and leave from the lower portion of the bay and go up and capture Mobile. So Farragut himself sent some scouts up to do a little reconnaissance to see what the Confederates had actually designed up at Mobile in these years. And he said, it's going to take a huge army, and it would be an elephant to take, in his words, and take a large army to hold it. So he didn't have anywhere near what he needed to capture Mobile, and he relayed that. And they said, well, how many men do you think it would take? And he said, it's going to take at least 40,000 men. Turns out the campaign for Mobile ultimately involved a federal army of 45,000 men fighting against a roughly 10,000 man Confederate army, and brought over 36 warships into the region. So those are pretty big numbers. And I always make the case that, of course, this is at Gettysburg. It's not the turning point of the war. But I think that we would know a whole lot more about it had it occurred a little bit earlier in the war. It gets completely overshadowed and forgotten because it occurred, the city of Mobile actually surrendered 3 days after Lee's army surrendered. But everybody gets confused on that because Lee didn't surrender every army in the field, but his was the most prominent. And a lot of people think Appomattox, that's the end of the war, everything else is a footnote. And so Mobile ends up being a footnote. But there's some consequential actions that we'll discuss. Before we get into the campaign itself, remember, during the war, the Confederacy had lost territory every year. So this is a great map showing you the territory that had been lost in the first, second, third, and fourth year of the war. And so 1865, that bright red, those are the pockets left of the South still under Confederate control. There's a lot of the South that's under federal control. Mobile, of course, even though things are not looking good for the Confederate war effort, if there was going to remain one for another campaign year, Mobile was going to be a vital part of it. You can see just the strategic geography here, population center, rail connections. What was left of the Confederacy, Mobile was the center portion of one of those pockets. So if they were going to be able to continue a war effort, Mobile was going to be a major target, and that's when the federal forces finally had accomplished other goals and were focusing on Mobile. Now, they are going to be confronted by Maury's Department of the Gulf that had roughly 10,000 men all told, and he realized very quickly that the main thrust of this effort to capture Mobile, ironically, is not going to attack Mobile itself. That was the best defended location. That's where you had all these rings of fortifications and gunboats and obstructions in the waterways. And so he actually sent most of his men to the eastern shore. That's where Spanish Fort Blakeley happened. And I'll explain a little bit of the strategic nature of that as we go. He is going to be attacked by an army under the overall command of General Canby, E.R.S. Canby. A column of that army is going to come from Pensacola and actually go north and then descend on Fort Blakeley. The others are going to actually move up the eastern shore, Baldwin County, go through what is now Fairhope and Daphne and Spanish Fort, making their way up to these fortifications. So they're approaching from two angles, two directions, as the federal fleet is coming into Mobile Bay. And here's a map showing tracking the general progress of those columns as they make their way up towards these fortifications. And there's an image of Weeks Bay, and there's a contemporary image showing this is one of the landing spots where they brought men and supplies and actually landed there and then marched up through Baldwin County. And it was a very slow go. Of course, if you've driven down to the beaches and seen 59 and everything, you know, it's kind of flat and you see all these fields. Well, obviously those nice paved roads weren't there at the time. And so it had a tendency when there was rain to turn into a real sloppy mess. You get 30,000 men and several thousand mules and wagons trying to make their way through basically hacking a new road in this clay, and it was a very slow process. So they didn't arrive by surprise. The Confederates knew they were coming, and it took them a few weeks to get there. And it was an arduous task to get all the way up there, marching through these fields and everything like that. So the first place they arrived is Spanish Fort. So let me backtrack just a second to help you understand. Spanish Fort, south of Fort Blakeley. These are two earthen fortifications that consist of over a mile or two of fortifications. Blakeley's 3 miles long. Spanish Fort's closer to 2. So why had they put all of their men, all the Confederate resources on the Eastern Shore, and why were the Federals trying to attack the Eastern Shore first? For one reason, as I said, Mobile had years to prepare. Any direct assault on Mobile was going to take a whole lot more men than anybody really wanted to devote to this. They had 4 years of war. They saw what was there. They knew a frontal assault was going to be just, they probably could do it, but it was going to cost a lot more lives than they thought they should be expending on this. If they could get into the waterways, and I should have put a map of, if you're probably familiar, the Mobile-Tensas Delta, you got all these waterways entering into Mobile Bay. If you follow those up, they come together into the Tombigbee and the Alabama River. So you can get, if you bypass Mobile, if you could get onto that eastern section of the Delta, which is the Tensas River, if you could go up there, you could essentially leave Mobile behind you and go into interior Alabama and target where we're at today, Montgomery. You could target Selma, which was one of the last major arsenals for the Confederacy. So those were some real targets, but they were real concerned about if they did that, no one wanted to leave a Confederate force blocking their way out down at Mobile Bay. So Canby decided from the get-go, he's going to attack, capture Mobile, dismantle those fortifications that were defending access to the river, which was Spanish Fort and Blakeley. Do that first, and then move into interior Alabama. And as it happened, it took him so long to do all that he never got into interior Alabama. Other raids accomplished that. Wilson's raid captured Mobile and Selma. But as they're marching from the south, the first place they get to is Spanish Fort. Spanish Fort is very similar to Blakeley, and the commander there said, my men who had fought in several places in the war, he said, my men are wider apart than they ever were under Johnston and Hood. The work's not so well managed, nor is strong. The enemy is a larger force, and we're acting closer. It all sounds like bad news for these guys, and that's what it was. They resisted as long as they could. The battlefield ended up looking like something out of World War I because the Federals are just overwhelmingly outnumbering the men at Spanish Fort, and they begin that siege on March 27th. It continues to April 8th, and during that interim, they actually sent men north to do the same thing at Blakeley, lay siege to Blakeley. So Spanish Fort and Blakeley were under siege at the same time, but the one at Spanish Fort began earlier. And if you're interested, there is a small section of Spanish Fort that is publicly accessible, Fort McDermott, and the rest of it is quite frankly a subdivision. So there's not a whole lot left of it. There are little segments of it, but this is the one major fortification within that several mile long line that is publicly accessible. And there's a image of a causeway, the Bayway. Just to give you some idea of the Spanish Fort Estates. This is where all this is, and that's downtown Mobile. So Spanish Fort, a little closer together, fewer men than at Blakeley. You had about 2,500 men. They surrender. Well, actually don't surrender. They evacuate on the night of April 8th. They are so, the Federals are so close, they can't return fire. The line is almost cut in half, and the commander realizes that they have gotten so close that not only is his army surrounded by an enormous army with water at its back, but now they've broken through one part of his line. And on Saturday night, April 8th, he realizes that if they renew the fighting the next day, his small army is in two pieces. So he made a stealthy evacuation, literally right under the noses of the Federals. And then the only thing you have left, the only major fortification that you have left defending the entire access to the river system and to Mobile is Fort Blakeley. So Fort Blakeley, this is a map of it. North is this way. The river's flowing south. This is Fort Blakeley, a 3-mile-long series of interconnected earthworks. It's not one spot. It's 3 miles long. It's punctuated by what we call readouts. These are these individual fortifications where you put men and artillery, and there are 9 of them studded along that line, taking advantage of the geography. And so there's readout 1, 2, on through 9. So if you go to our park, you will have access to at least part of every one of them, except the one that's gone, which is readout 1. So all that line is there. But if you will notice, when the Federals arrived, they laid siege to the place, so they dug 3 distinct lines of trenches as they got closer. It's a siege beginning April 1st. So in our park, we have 3 times as many Federal earthworks still in existence, all amazingly preserved. We probably got 12 miles of earthworks in the park. But that is Fort Blakeley. This is a contemporary map done by the Alabama Battlefield Trust, lays it out with north that direction, maybe make a little bit more sense to you. This is roughly where Fort Blakeley is, that line, and this is where the Federals were attacking, all along that line. What did Fort Blakeley look like? This is not Fort Blakeley, this is Atlanta, but it would have looked a lot like this to the approaching Federals because the Confederates had put everything they could out in front of the earthworks. They had cleared the land for several hundred yards, largely with slave labor in the fall and early spring of '65, and put everything to slow down enemy assault. Should there be an assault, you're going to have to hack your way through abatis, chevaux de frise, while guys are shooting at you. So it was one way to counter the enormous manpower disparity because the Federals had over 16,000 guys, the Confederates roughly 3,500. And this is an image of Redoubt 4 today. I'll go into more detail on that later, but we've tried to reconstruct some of the fortifications the Confederates put in one portion of the battlefield to help people understand what it looked like at the time. And remember, this is a combined force operation. I'm not going to go into a whole lot on the naval component, but there were some pretty serious warships that were involved in this. And to counter it, there were never Confederate versus Federal naval action, so to speak, right in Mobile Bay, but there was ship-to-shore firing, both ways, Federals and Confederate. And ships such as these are 2 that were actually sunk by mines in the waterways around Spanish Fort, because the Confederates would lace these things with these floating mines that would drift downriver, hit the hulls. They lost 7 ships, the Federal Navy did, in the campaign for Mobile. These are 2 of them. This is the Chickasaw, which it's just an interesting story. This thing was in the Battle of Mobile Bay. It participated in this, survived it after the war, was decommissioned. Its hull was put into use as a barge on the Mississippi River, and it stayed working until it sunk at anchor in 1947. So that's an interesting lifespan for one of these vessels. So Fort Blakeley, under the overall command of General St. John Richardson Liddell, he's got about 3,500 guys. Half of them are veterans of all the Civil War battles in the Western Theater you probably heard of, Vicksburg, Atlanta, Nashville, so on. They're under Cockrell. The other half are raw conscripts under Bryan. They called them the Boy Brigade. These are guys who had been conscripted at the last moment, mostly very young men, with some older gentlemen, too old or too young to have been drafted previously. There are accounts of Federals after the battle looking at the trenches, and they said lying dead in the trenches were gentlemen that looked like they were too young to shave next to guys with white beards. So this was the last man forced into the ranks. Most of these had not been in the Army previously, most of the guys under Bryan's command. This is something that's actually in the archives collection here. Is not to scale, but this gives you some notion of how they constructed these fortifications that I'm talking about, the readouts. And I may have a better image, but it's an earthen fortification, and you got your men behind here. You don't always have that nice pointed stick. It looks pretty much medieval right there, but that's really not on the battlefield. But what they did do, what is interesting on this, is they show that once they cut down those trees, the tops of those longleaf pine become a barrier to themselves. So they put all that stuff out there on purpose to slow anybody down. And that's what was out in the battlefield at Blakeley. This is a image drawn the year after the war, looking towards Redoubt 4. And you can still see some of the stuff that was all thrown out in the field everywhere. And that is what a redoubt looks like, basically a small fort. What you can't make out very well is this. And over here, that's the interconnecting trenches. So it's all connected, 3 miles long, where men can move along it. So this is a map of the park, which I know looks a little confusing to you. Let me point out two things that you need to understand. One, this is the Confederate line snaking through, bisecting the park. And these are the redoubts, these circles. So if you come here, you're going to be able to see those. And this is the federal, the last of the 3 federal lines. This is the line from which they launched the attack, the assault on Fort Blakeley after the culmination of that siege. So if you come to Blakeley, anywhere in the park, you're on a battlefield. We have a portion of the park that we call the battlefield. It's the only portion that's cleared between the federal and the Confederate lines. We do a lot of reenacting up there. But anyway, in truth, that's one small portion of it. If you come to the park, you're on the battlefield. And they were taking, truly, even before you turn in the park, this cemetery is across the road from our entrance. It's about 1.5 miles from Redoubt 4. And there were guys who were taking fire there, who were camped there at the 6th Minnesota. And there's a funny quote. He was camped beneath, there was a gentleman who was camped next to this grave, which is the grave of a Revolutionary War veteran named Zachariah Godbold. He was riding home, and he said in the top of one of the pine trees that he was camped under, a Confederate shell knocked the top of the pine tree, and it fell right between his tent and this grave. And he said, he wrote home, he said, thankfully, the shell did not injure living or dead. So this was a siege. So this sort of a whirlwind introduction to all of it. But what was going on during that siege? Well, the Army was trying to get closer to the Confederate lines to either force them to surrender or where they could get close enough to overwhelm them. And what they were doing day to day is if you weren't on the front lines, you were riding back home, you were cooking, you were playing baseball. This is not an image from Blakeley, but we do have accounts where they said they played games of ball behind the lines. They had a little bit of a cat and mouse game going because every single day the Confederates are watching for what the Federals are doing to try to slow them down as they get closer and closer. And they're within rifle range, but they do most of their digging and actually digging the earthworks at night to make themselves a little more difficult to see. So the Confederates in turn started firing calcium light shells that are sort of like big Roman candles where they could briefly light up the battlefield, see where these guys are, and turn their guns on them. So the siege is around the clock fighting in some capacity for throughout the whole week, really 9 days of the siege that's going on. It's not just waiting to that final moment. So this is an aerial view of Redoubt 4 today. That's Redoubt 4. That's a reconstruction of the line of sharpened stakes we know the Confederates had placed there. You can see the big cleared area, and you can still appreciate the engineering that went into this. This was an engineered, professionally engineered line, 3 miles long, drawn out, planned. And this is the Tensas River in the background, and that's downtown Mobile, RSA Tower. That's what Blakeley is defending. And there's that image that I spoke that was done during the bicentennial that we're able to get a lot of historical detail in there, down to people, individuals that we knew were there. We've got one guy drawn in over here on a horse with one leg. That was Elijah Gates from Missouri, and he was there, and he had lost part of a leg. We've even got one of our park rangers who's a reenactor, and he posed for this, and he shows up about 5 or 6 times in this painting if you look up real well. So sort of the Where's Waldo of Civil War paintings. Want to go through a little bit. Just again, I'm not going to try to read the book to you in this presentation, but I've got some really interesting quotes that will help you understand a little bit of the way I've arranged it. And Redoubt 4, where that painting depicts, is really one of the central places we interpret the battle. It's where some of the most vicious fighting took place. And there's some great quotes that come out of it that help you understand what the perspective of these guys were. The Federals, particular C.C. Andrews, said men were dashing on and over the obstructions like a stormy wave. He talked about being able to see for over 1 mile in either direction, see these 16,000 men rushing. Must have been an incredible sight. There's another one, Henry Hart. He said that once the battle began, 15,000 men were marching steady into the jaws of death. So this is all happening April 9th, 5:30 p.m. Yes, the very day Robert E. Lee surrendered his army of Northern Virginia earlier. But that day and time, they determined after Spanish Fort had been evacuated, the federal high command said, we have no interest in capturing empty earthworks. Don't let this army escape to Mobile, and we don't want to continue doing this. People are dying every day. We want to capture the army. They were within roughly 500 to 600 yards of them during that siege, so they could see each other. And they said, we're not going to get any closer. We're going to organize an all-out assault 5:30 p.m. Sunday, April 9th, to prevent that Confederate army from making any attempt to flee. So that's the Battle of Fort Blakeley. The siege preceded it. So we're going to go north to south real quick, sort of a whirlwind approach to understanding what happened there. I'm going to call out a few quotes, and I just want to help you understand that the battle ends up being sort of 9 individual fights. And the way that I've arranged the book, we'll just go north to south to talk about a few of the individual regiments, individuals who were there, and the accounts they left to give you a little bit of understanding of what it was all about. So readouts 1 and 2 are in the northern part of the battlefield. This is the park that you have regular access to, our camping and everything, our trails. That's what's depicted here. But the park and the Historic Blakeley Foundation own significantly more land that we are just now beginning to develop some trails in. You actually have to leave the park to access this. And that you have to actually go up there to see readouts. So where readouts 1 and 2 were. So we're going to start in that northernmost section. And that section happened to be attacked by one of the largest contingents of African-American soldiers to fight in any Civil War battle. The Hawkins Division, made up of the United States Colored Troops. They were called USCT. That was their name at the time. And this is not an image of the guys who were actually there, but we don't have any of the actual units. But about 4,000 to 5,000 guys participated in this, mostly former slaves who had volunteered to fight for the Federals, and they assaulted that northern portion of the Confederate line. And that's what it looked like the year after the battle. We think that's readout 2. Readout 1 would have been over here, and of course that's heading south, so readout 3 would be out here. The park does own a portion of readout 2, owns all of readout 3, and the rest of the battlefield. Some great quotes to help you give you a little bit of a sense of the action here. Captain Lewis Snare said that they were burning with an impulse to do honor to their race. They were literally fighting for their freedom. So it's a pretty dramatic story that played out there, just one of the many stories within the larger story. But some of the Confederates saw all this happening, and some actually tried to run to surrender to the assaulting white troops further down the line. So the USCT sustained a lot of casualties, did not capture on paper, were not credited with capturing as many of the Confederate soldiers as guys right next to them, because a lot of the Confederates were running to try to surrender to them rather than to the USCT troops. And there's some ugly incidents that happened in that charge. There's accounts that there were guys yelling, remember Fort Pillow, which had been a massacre of slaves and Federal soldiers in Tennessee. And at the very last minutes of the battle, there are credible reports that there were Confederates who had surrendered or were in the act of surrendering that were fired on. But they quickly got order restored. As best I can tell, there were 2 or 3 guys, maybe 1 or 2 more than that, who were actually killed in the act of surrendering. Either they knowingly or by accident, but the Federal officer saw what was happening, got control of the situation, and actually, by more than one account, actually shot one of their own men to stop that sort of stuff from happening. So there's some difficult things that we have to wrestle with as we guide people through this experience, but we interpret that at our battlefield trail now. So going further south, readouts 3 and 4. This is sort of the center of the park, quite literally, and this is where we do a lot of our interpretation. This is where, if you ever see us doing a reenactment, this is the big open field we charge across. It's the only place in the park that you could actually see the Federal line and the Confederate at one place. So this is a image of overhead image of assault. This is a detailed map showing all the guys, all the various units that were converging on Redoubt 4, and we would love to eventually get that done for all 9 of the redoubts, but that gives you some sense of what was happening. And this is the assault here is where I took the quote from an account of a guy who was in the 37th Illinois, who described as the battle began, the thunder and lightning of battle rose above. I thought that sounded pretty dramatic, so good way to describe it. And one other thing I'll mention as I'm going through these quotes, here's one talking about a howling storm of balls and shells. I've been trying to track down images of the flags of the units who were involved in the battle in repositories across the nation and get as many of those as I could included in the book. See, sort of these are the things that guided them into battle and remnants of the battle in a way that I can't have the actual flag, but I could have the images and help connect you with those units. So I've got a lot of images of these banners, regimental flags, United States flags, and a few Confederate. Here's one that's really torn up from the 83rd Ohio, and they talked about the sharpened stakes and the wire. That's an interesting point. The Confederates had put everything they could out in front of the fortifications, including telegraph wire that they strung between stumps of all those trees they had cut down in certain places, designed to trip people up. You didn't expect telegraph wire to be on the battlefield, and literally when they're making their assault, I do have an account or two of guys who said that all the guys marching with him or running with him tripped on this thing and they all went face first. So it worked for half a second. Now, did that materially help the Confederates? I don't think so. There's one gentleman, Eddington of the 76th Illinois, said that is the hours that tried men's souls. Another talking about all the obstructions, all manner of obstructions. One of the ones that was most despised was that the Confederates put in certain places, they put torpedoes, what they call torpedoes. We would call them landmines out in front of the lines in certain places well before the battle. So they didn't know if they would actually be assaulted, but if they were, they intended these things to slow down anybody trying to advance towards them. And it just so happened that one of the major minefields was just beyond where the federal trenches had ended. So they had dug to this certain point. They said, we're going to assault the next day. They had not tripped any landmines. They didn't know they were there. During the assault, some of the first federal casualties are guys stepping out of the trenches. 10 yards away, they step into a minefield and there's guys getting the legs blown off and stuff. So, I mean, it's pretty traumatic. And of course, you can imagine how well this manner of warfare was received by the Federals. Thought it was pretty barbarous. Here, one of the few accounts, we don't have as many accounts of the Confederates because there are no after-action reports. The Federals assault Fort Blakeley and they ultimately capture Fort Blakeley. And everybody who is not killed or is sent to prisons, and the war is over. And so there's no organized after-action report. So a lot of what we have come from the Federals, but then we have after the war accounts by Confederates who wrote in places like Confederate Veteran Magazine, or wrote letters to family or friends, or published letters in newspapers. So we've got to piece their account together. There's one from Kavanaugh, who was in the Missouri Regiment, who said that it appeared to him all hell had turned loose. Every man in the United States was practicing on us, repeating rifles. So we go further south, readouts 5 and 6. That's what it looked like at the time. This is still a major park road. Cuts right through some of our major public use areas. There's some of the earthworks in the area. That's what the federal line looks like, and a large part of it today. Charles Hills and his guys were, if you ever come to any of our events, our music events, things like that, we set up and do a lot of our interpretation right there where those guys charge. It's right near a main campground, a tent campground, restrooms, facilities, all that is in an area where 160-something years ago was right in the middle of a major battle. Again, I'm not going to read every one of these quotes. I've got different presentations I do for folks. I pack a lot of these in here. I want to just highlight a few. Very tail end of the line, readout 7, 8, and 9. That's what readout 9 looks like today. We've got a guy there who left an interesting account, the 119th Illinois. Illinois talked about being so close to the muzzles of the gun that when they discharged, the air pressure knocked them back into the ditch. And he thought for a second that that was it. You know, he was in the afterlife, and he woke up and realized that nothing hit him. It was just a concussion. That's how close he was. A lot of interesting stories there. And incidentally, Missouri is the only state that had organized regiments fighting on both sides at Blakeley. We've got, I think, 19 states in total represented, and Missouri had troops in the Federal Army and the Confederate Army at Blakeley. So the very final moments of the battle, after all Fort Blakeley falls, the assault's at 5:30 p.m. By about 6:15, most every one of these readouts are in the very final moments of trying to resist. They were outnumbered 5 or 6 to 1. A few guys saw what was happening and ran back towards the river and the old town of Blakeley site, which Blakeley had been a town. It was named Fort Blakeley, but there was no town there at the time. The shell of a lot of the buildings were there. It was used as the place where all the supplies were brought in for the troops, because there's still a dock system there. So they were running back towards the river, hoping to find a way to get across the river to escape. There's an interesting account of a quartermaster who had been kind of drafted into helping with an amputation of someone right when the battle broke out. And he heard all this happening and was anxious to go, and he jumped into the river, pulled up a plank from one of the wharves, was trying to paddle across, and saw all the bullets in the water around him. And there were guys shot in the water. He said, I concluded not to take a plank ride just then. So he turned around, surrendered. So the last moments of the battle literally play out on our riverfront. And some of the very final moments of the CSS Nashville, which was built here in Montgomery, one of the largest ironclads the Confederacy built, was in the area, had nosed up to the dock. And the captain there said, I rescued such of the garrison as was able to float themselves off. So very few survivors or guys who escaped the Battle of Fort Blakeley on the Confederate side made it on the nose of this vessel, which backed up and deposited on the opposite side of the river. So that's some of the very last shots that were fired. So Fort Blakeley falls, Mobile falls to the Federal Army. April 12th. There was no further fighting in Mobile. After Blakeley falls, you've only got 2 big batteries basically out in the Delta between the Federals and Mobile. They hold out for a day or two. They evacuate. The Federals send some emissaries over to Mobile, and the mayor and a contingent of citizens meet them with a flag of truce. It was a bed sheet, and they were waving it and surrendered the city. They said there's no forces left. Everybody had evacuated. So Mobile becomes one of the last major city to fall during the war. It's April 12th, 1865. So we got 14 medals of honor awarded at Blakeley. You can learn about it if you're there. There are guys who participated in the battle that are buried in the National Cemetery over in Mobile. We do reenactments, living history programs. We have a collection of artifacts, either that we own or are on loan, and we're trying to get some help and some money to build an interpretive center and a museum to display all this. So that's one of our big goals right now. We've got a number of panels, interpretive panels, self-guided tour, audio tour, a lot of ways for you to explore the battlefield. You don't have to have an organized tour to experience it. We've got just a few monuments. But what we mainly have are miles and miles of some of the best preserved Civil War earthworks anywhere in the nation. We're very proud of the preservation at Blakeley, and it's just an amazing place to come experience nature and to come experience a turning point in nation's history. And I always tell groups, again, I'm not saying that Blakeley is the pivotal battle upon which everything turned, but it's our local connection. And by local, I mean the Gulf Coast, and in some ways the state of Alabama. It's one of the best places. It's the largest Civil War battlefield in the state. It's one of the best places to understand what happened in the war and appreciate that without having to go hundreds of miles away. And I will mention in that northern part that we talked about, Redoubt 1 and 2, where those USCT troops were, we have begun developing that as a separate trail system unto itself. So we have the USCT Heritage Trail, which is a part of the park. It's a 1.5 mile trail system, takes you to all 3 parallels of the earthworks that those guys built under fire. And we were very honored to recently have the Historical Association present us with a marker as a part of the History Revealed program that Scotty heads up. And we just have installed that, and I think it's a beautiful historic marker there sitting on Cloverleaf Landing Road, just north of the park proper. But that's all park property. We just happen to have a very large ravine and beaver pond and other things between the developed portion of the park and this. So for the moment, you must leave the park, go up a mile, and come back to experience the USCT Heritage Trail. But we hope to remedy that one day. And one of the most interesting ways that we acquaint people with all this history is through our tours. We're a cruise operator. We've got a boat, and 49 passenger boat. We've got over 36 cruises we do throughout the Delta, down into Mobile Bay, up into the upper Delta. And one of those is one I narrate called The Civil War on the Eastern Shore. And we take you across all these battlefields via water. And then we show you a few places that you can only get to by water where earthen fortifications were during the battle. So it's a unique opportunity and a unique way to experience Blakeley and the war. And I have, if I can switch this, let me see. I can't remember. I may just have to click on this again. I've got a short video. Whoops. Let me go back through this. Got a short video. We have on our website, we've got a series of videos, short videos that we utilize in collaboration or coordination with our audio tour program. And we've got a series of short videos, 4 or 5 minutes at most, that help bring certain portions of the battle to life. I'm going to attempt to do this, if it will go to the website, and pull up one of those for you. It's about 4 minutes, and we'll show you this and then see if I can take any questions. When the order for the federal assault to begin at 5:30 p.m. was given, nearly 16,000 men, all along the 3-mile-wide line, stepped out from their trenches and made their way towards Fort Blakeley. In an instant, the full weight of rebel ordnance in front of them was directed at the attackers. The charge was one of the largest of the entire war, and a spectacle unlike anything seen in the war on the Gulf Coast before or since. It was a glorious sight, remembered one observer, a line of 15,000 men marching steady into the jaws of death. Every step we made was marked by a howling storm of shells and balls, which felt like hailstones all about us, remembered one soldier. Federal troops had reached the main Confederate line within a few minutes, though the battle would rage on for nearly another half hour. In a matter of just 45 minutes, it would all be over. Fort Blakeley lay in Federal hands. Its garrison had been captured, and hundreds of men in blue and gray would be laying dead or wounded all along the battlefield. None who survived it would forget the drama. Okay, that's one of the videos we have, which is sort of the battle in miniature, a little overview of the entire assault. So appreciate your attention, appreciate you coming out today. Be glad to answer any questions I can. I know we've got a few minutes left.
A quick round of applause for our speakers. We do have time for some questions. I'll ask that you let me bring the mic to you so our visitors who are online can hear the question. Also, if you are watching online and you have a question, you can put that in the chat feature and we can ask that as well. Someone here in the audience? We'll start here.
Okay, there was an advance on Spanish Fort and Blakeley from southern Baldwin County. Steel came over from Pensacola. Where did when the Confederate Army was captured, I understood they went to Stark's Landing, that they were held up by the island batteries, that the Union shipping wasn't working yet. Where did those prisoners from Blakeley go? Was it Stark's Landing, or did they wait and catch boats and go to Ship Island at a later date?
They marched them down. I believe a lot of them would have been picked up by boats around Stark's Landing and then taken on to Ship Island.
Where is Stark's Landing?
Oh, that is basically Daphne. The Daphne waterfront, if you're familiar with.
Landmark.
Yeah, there's a historic marker there, and part of the Mobile Bay Campaign Trail series of interpretive panels. There's one there talking about it, but it was constructed basically as the place where the Federals, after capturing everything, used as the base for all their supplies when they were sending men over to occupy Mobile. And so that was sort of a hub for all the waterborne activity with the federal force after the war. So it's very likely, although I don't know this 100%, it's very likely that a lot of those Confederates were marched to pick up boats there to go out to Ship Island.
Why did they try to defend a 3-mile front with so few troops? Was the original garrison larger?
Well, they're always trying to be as optimistic as they can, I would suppose. They knew they didn't have quite the force, but the engineer designed the fortification to take advantage of the high ground and the natural land. That's why Blakeley, the town of Blakeley and everything is where it is. It's on that nice bluff that had been occupied by various, even Native American groups, colonial troops. It had been a place of occupation over the centuries. So he designed something that would defend that pivotal point where the river bends there on that bluff. And, you know, I guess the thinking was if it actually came to be under a direct assault, that the Confederacy might find a way to get sufficient men from other places to go defend it. As it happened, when it did come under assault, they could only spare roughly 3,500. They could have easily had 3 times that number or more in that line, but the men weren't just available.
Manpower-wise, what was the ratio between Confederate and Federal?
In the entire campaign or just Fort Blakeley?
Fort Blakeley.
At Fort Blakeley, 16,000 Federals and about 3,500
I was really amazed, all the generals that you mentioned in this story. Where did they all come from? How were they trained?
On both sides, a sort of a catch-all answer is that both had served in a variety of other campaigns in the war and got assigned to this area after participating in, I always say, in all the major campaigns you've heard of in the Western Theater. It just is a matter of where they were when they ordered that all the troops be put together for this assault, and who was not actively involved in something else. So you ended up with a catch-all forces, and a lot of them were actually shipped down to New Orleans and then on over to Mobile Bay. Of course, still had men that were mustered in Pensacola, and the Confederates. Basically, you've got the very, very last elements of the Army of Tennessee that had been shipped down there. And then, of course, you've got guys who were raised with conscription in the last months of the war, and then a hodgepodge of other regiments that had been almost decimated. You've got Alabama and Mississippi regiments that are just a few guys left out of regiments that had served for 3 or 4 years, and they all just, whoever's available, ended up being gathered up and said, this is the next point that we need to try to defend. So it's a really quite a diverse assemblage of men that's down at Fort Blakeley.
So what's next for Blakeley, Mike? What do you have on the horizons?
Well, we've got opportunities to trying to secure a little bit of federal and state support and some private support to do some big projects on our riverfront. We want to add some additional camping and cabins, things like that. We're looking at expanding our cruise operations. We've recently had our roads paved, and our next single big project is the Interpretive Center, new staff area, new place to hold events, and a small museum, and a really nice introduction to this entire park. Because as you saw, it's a 2,000-acre park. We've got 30 miles of trails. It's a big place, and we need a first stop for large groups, especially, and to hold educational programs. So that's the big single thing we're working towards right now.
You have another question? We'll make Mr. Singleton's question here the final one.
Mike, I've always been interested in the Lady Slocum cannon. Any chance we'll ever get it back?
I would never say never, but it's over in New Orleans right now, and they're probably interested in holding on to it, but it was at Spanish Fort. Yeah.
All right, another round of applause for Mike Bunn. As we finish up today, I want to say April is the time around here where we honor our volunteers, and we have one of our wonderful volunteers in the room today who's responsible for our coffee and our waters. Ms. Dale, thank you for that. And as you leave the building and you see some of the people who are out and they're working at our front desk and they're greeting people, most of those are volunteers. And if you feel like you want to be one of those people, you can see Callie right here. Wave, Callie, with her good arm. We won't make you wave with the other. We are so thankful always for the support of our volunteers and your continued support of this program. We look forward to seeing you back on May 16th for Leighton Revel, who's going to talk to us about the history of the Southern Negro Leagues. Thanks, everybody, and be well.